Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Hello, BS listeners, and welcome back to another episode. Today, I'm really excited to have on Ashley Whillans. Ashley is an assistant professor in the Negotiation, Organizations, and Markets Unit, teaching the negotiations course to MBA students at Harvard. Broadly, she studies how people navigate trade-offs between time and money. Her ongoing research investigates whether and how intangible incentives, such as experiential and time-saving rewards, affect employee motivation and well-being. In both 2015 and 2018, she was named a Rising Star of Behavioral Science by the International Behavioral Exchange and the Behavioral Science and Policy Association. In 2016, she co-founded the Department of Behavioral Science in the Policy, Innovation, and Engagement Division of the British Columbia Public Service. Her research has been published in numerous academic journals and popular media outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Her first book, Time Smart: How to Reclaim Your Time and Live a Happier Life, was published recently by Harvard Business Publishing. So, Ashley, congrats on the book and welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me.
And we were chatting before. We hit record, and I didn't ask you this, but I'll ask you it now because you were trained at UBC for a graduate student, like PhD.
Yeah, I did my BA, my MA, and my PhD at UBC. Vancouver's a really nice place to be, and most undergrads try to leave their undergraduate institution, and UBC is the one institution where all the psych undergrads desperately try to stay there forever.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm Canadian, and my family.
So that was my next question: is, are you Canadian?
I am. You're a Canadian too, right? Or no?
Here we go. Yeah, I am. Yeah, Toronto. I sort of moved around the greater Toronto area, and I'm so ashamed to admit this. I've never been west, like any direction west in Canada, which is crazy.
Maybe you should add that to your post-pandemic travel list.
Yeah, I definitely should. And I mean, that's just, it goes to the vastness of Canada as a country. Like, I've been to Europe, I've been many other parts of the world, and yet I haven't explored like majority of my own country.
I know. I feel like this too. I always feel like such a bad Canadian. I'm definitely a Vancouverite. I have a little bit of family in Toronto, so I've been there and literally have gone nowhere else in Canada. And so I also think a road trip across the country at some point in life is in order, because Canada is a huge place and there's so much of it to explore that I think many Canadians don't actually get around to doing, like us.
I know. Like
our head was in books, I think, though.
Exactly. Yeah. We're too concerned about Excel data sheets. And
I think that's right.
Yeah. It's funny, here we are. This is what a tangent to start the show off, but I swear we'll talk about your book and other research. There's this ad, and it's all, I love seeing advertisements and marketing in general that's all sort of updated to reflect the realities of COVID now. And this one, I think it's for like an RV or something like that. And it's this young family and this young girl who should be in school, but she's not. And the sort of the copy of the advertisement says, well, since you don't have to be in school, you can learn anywhere. And so there's this little girl who's like learning about leaves in the woods as her family embarks on this like cross, country journey in an RV. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, new way of like learning about and attending school. So there you have it. Maybe that's on our plan. Go across the country.
But now you're in Boston. For 2021. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty stationary in Boston. My partner is a physician, so I'd love to be working from anywhere, but he works in one singular place, so I work in our spare bedroom.
Yeah, he's one of those professions where they actually have to go into a physical location. Yes, my partner as well, a high school teacher, and I think a lot of people have realized this: when you are fortunate enough to do your job and to advance within your career while sitting in your pajamas or sweatpants, maybe with a nice top or a nice shirt, at home all the time. I think it's such a privilege for us to do that.
Yeah, it really is. Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's get into this book, which is excellent. I really enjoyed it because, I mean, I love when social psychologists or psychologists and behavioral scientists just take their research and write for a more popular audience, and do that really important piece of translation. Because as we know, and as a lot of my listeners know, because I'll probably harp on this all the time, is that we have too much of that knowledge that sort of stays in the institutions, and we publish in our journals, and we talk to our fellow academics at conferences, SPSB, and these sorts of things, and all too often we don't hear about that information and that knowledge being shared with the public at large. So this is a great example of that, and it's a really nice blend between like you discussing the research, mostly your own and your collaborators' research over the years, but with like some like I mean you can't see this, I'm showing you, but like worksheet kind of style, and I'm yet to fill it in. As you can see, it's blank lines. Um, but yeah, it's really sort of very practical, which I really enjoyed. So good on you on that front. Did you First question, did when you sort of sat down and at the moment where you decided that you were going to write this book, did you have an idea in your head? Did you have the framework? Was it just going to be a manuscript repurposed, written a little bit of different way, or yeah, what did that look like for you?
Yeah, so the I think this point around trying to bring to light some of the findings I was uncovering in my dissertation and work, and some of the work I've been doing subsequently, and put it into practice was the very reason I wrote the book. So I talk a little bit about this in the book at the beginning, but as a junior faculty member at the Harvard Business School who studied time and happiness, I often felt like I was a paradox. Like,
Mm.
do what my research says, but don't do what I do would be something that my colleagues and I would talk a lot about.
Yeah,
And it
yeah.
seems kind of, it would be a little bit funny, like we'd make jokes over work meetings about it. But the importance of time really came into the forefront of my mind when, I was giving some academic talk and talking about how people who prioritize time have much better romantic relationships because they spend more quality time together and they really put their relationships first in their life. And at the same time, I was going through a pretty dramatic breakup with a partner of 10 years that had moved across the continent for me and my job.
Mm,
And this realization dawned on me. If I was having such a freaking difficult time prioritizing time over money, putting what I see in my data into practice in my own life, other people must be struggling too. And is
mm,
there a way that I can both help myself and help others live in a way that's consistent with the values that we say we have, that we want to have, that we aspirationally have, and actually put those values into practice on a daily basis. So the book is intentionally practical because, well, being an academic, I could sit in my proverbial armchair and talk a lot theoretically about time, what it means, where our notions of time came from. And I wanted to, and my book editor said, no, absolutely not. This chapter cannot be 50 pages long. Um, I really wanted to give people actionable strategies that they could try to implement in the context of their own life to start putting time first and happiness first. So the book is deliberately practical so that
mhm,
it is deliberately translating what I've seen in the data from many years of studying time, money, and happiness, reviewing papers, conducting like reviews and writing chapters for academic publications and saying, okay, given all that we know about time and happiness, what does this mean for how we need to live our life? What does this mean for how we should plan our time within days, across months, across years of our lives? How do we actually put those changes into practice? And so the book started with a Harvard Business Review article that I had written
mm.
in January 2019 with uh, I think it was 2018 actually, yeah. I think a lot of time has gone by during COVID that just
Yeah, yeah,
completely
yeah, yeah.
unaccounted for. I'm like, "Wait,
Speaking of time,
that's the wrong year."
yeah.
January 2018 with my book editor, who is now my book editor, he was the editor of that article. And that HBR set up the framework, and the actual writing was pretty straightforward since after the HBR was published, it's a long form feature, about 6,000 words. We
Mm,
had a kind of concrete plan for the 5 chapters we
mm,
wanted to include, and I went ahead and wrote those, and that became the book. So again, I've been studying this topic for many, many years. So there's definitely an abundance of content. And it was just a matter of trying to organize it in a way that was straightforward, simple, had to be efficient. My book editor's like, you cannot write a long time management book. It has to be economical. He did not let me go on academic tangents. And so we already had a framework in mind when we set out and wrote the book, and it was going to be short and practical with worksheets and strategies to implement time smart practices in the context of
Mm,
everyday life.
very cool. And that comes through very clearly, right? Like right from the outset, which is great. Now, well, first thing I want to say is I love, because this is such a common thing you hear from really some sort of behavioral social scientists. Usually social psychologists is like the me search research. You end up settling on like a topic because it's something that's so close to your heart, or something that has profound implications for you in your life. So it sounds like you're another data point in that data set. Yeah.
As one of my senior colleagues likes to say, we study what we're bad at. I
Yeah,
think
that's
that this
exactly.
is true here in this case.
Yeah. So for me, I don't know what my case would be, but I was raised in this sort of like really devout Catholic family, like not weird and cultish or anything like that, but just like pious. And then when I went to university undergrad, I totally just like pushed against it, and now I'm like sort of an like atheist slash agnostic, and then I went to grad school. I was like, okay, what am I going to study? And I'm like, I'm fascinated in like why people believe, and why, like, like the dark side of human religiosity, like human religious belief, to the dismay of my parents. But yeah, I'm also a case of me search research, I think. So have you improved? Are you now more time affluent over, as having studied this for 5-10 years and now writing a book on
Yeah, I think within days, no. Across days, yes. So if you
it?
ask me on any particular day how time affluent I'm feeling, I'm like, I stacked all my meetings and I said yes to too many things. What have I done? But if you look at across weeks, I definitely make more time to put social relationships first by putting more leisure, exercise, social connection time into my calendar and treating it as very important and
Mm,
from a prioritization perspective, which I just never did before. I think I was always putting work first, not always deliberately or intentionally, but just that was always felt like the most urgent thing to be doing, and
yeah.
that always had to come before everything else. And I make a much more concerted effort now to make all of the other goals I have in my life at least as important as work,
Hmm.
and as my most important work. And that's gone a long way in making me feel more fulfilled and happier and have better social relationships across weeks in my life. I think
Hmm.
I can still do better on a day-to-day basis. I think working from home, and we've seen this in our data, has been really challenging. We're living at work. There's very little separation between work and home. We are in fact getting more emails and having more meetings. Every conversation has to be a meeting. Virtual teaching is more exhausting. We're in
Mm,
back to back Zoom meetings. We forget to take breaks. We just schedule one thing after another. And so I don't think I'm alone in this either. And this is where we're doing a lot of research now. And surprisingly, is how virtual work means that the nature of work has to change, and what workplaces need to do and individuals need to do to help better manage work life balance in a complete remote environment.
hmm.
So I think I have room to improve on a daily basis, but across areas of my life more broadly, I think I'm doing much better. I hope my partner would agree. I'm now happily engaged. I'm having a Zoom wedding in about
Ah,
3 weeks. I think by the time this airs, I will be married
yeah. Yeah.
over Zoom and a mass city hall ceremony, very COVID-esque, I know.
Wow. Yeah.
So I think that's if that outcome is any indication, I think I'm doing a little bit better with regard to putting social relationships first today than I did before.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I'm not only did I enjoy the book, and I'm going to read it again and actually do the exercises, but this is really good for me, and I think I need it because I'm as bad as anyone at when it comes to this sort of stuff. I say yes to too many things, and I'm overly ambitious with taking on projects because it seems like in an abstract sense, oh yeah, I could do this. Like there's 40 hours in a week, or 50, 60 hours in a week of work, quote unquote work time. And when I sort of this must be a thing. Like how I construe it in my mind, it is an obvious yes, I can do that one more project. But then in the day to day, hour to hour, once the meetings start piling on top of one another, it's like, oh shit, I can't do this. This is way too much. Um, and even my wife holds me to account, and my daughter as well, as she's only 3, but she goes, I'm this is how she's like typing, like, and she's like, I'm daddy to like working, but like that's all I do apparently. So my family holds me to account. And just right before this recording, I stacked meetings upon meetings and got up early to do some stuff. And then my wife said to me, she's like, "Why are you running? You're running around the house." Like I was running up and down the stairs, and it's so I'm awful. So I really hope to take some personal insights out from this book. And I want to pull a quote, uh, which says, "My research." This is from the book. "My research suggests that paying for a house cleaner might do as much for your marriage as learning how to be a better listener." Can you tell our listeners, a little bit about what that is and what's going on there?
Yeah, sure. So to put all of this conversation into context, all these feelings we're talking about, running around our house, feeling like we're rushing between meetings, this can contribute to feelings of time poverty, which is something I talk a lot about in my research, which is a feeling of having too many things to do and not enough time in the day to do them. And we're not alone in this conversation that you and I have been having about our personal lives. 80% of employed adults living in North America and more broadly around the world on average report feeling overwhelmed by the demands of work and life. And these feelings of time poverty can have negative effects for our happiness, both overall, how well we think we're doing in life, our life satisfaction, and also how happy we feel on an everyday basis, how much stress, sadness, worry, joy, pleasure, excitement that we feel on an everyday basis. In one data set, these feelings of time poverty had a stronger negative effect than being unemployed. So we're not
Mm,
these stressors that come with feeling overwhelmed are not trivial by any stretch of the imagination. So as
mhm,
I talk about in the book and in my research, we can think about strategies to help all of us take control of our time. Some of them involve money. So with the strategy that you pulled the quote from the book is this strategy that I talk about called funding time. So one way of helping us feel more in control of our schedule is to buy ourselves out of tasks that are unpleasant and create stress and are unproductive. So we want to think
mm,
about getting rid of the most negative moments of our day in order to have more time for the positive. And so in some of our data, we found that spending money to save time, even in amounts as little as $40 Canadian, can have significant benefits, causal benefits for our mood. So we randomly assigned employed, this was part of my dissertation, randomly assigned employed Canadians in the Vancouver area, as we were mentioning earlier in this conversation, to spend two payments of $40 on two consecutive weekends. On one weekend, they spent $40 to save themselves time. On the second weekend, they bought a material purchase for themselves. We counterbalanced the order. And what we found is that at the end of the day, people reported greater happiness and less stress when they spent money to save themselves time, even with
mm.
a purchase of $40. So we've now done a whole bunch of other studies subsequent to this, looking at the effect for relationship satisfaction. We saw in the initial studies that part of the reason people were feeling happier after they made a time-saving purchase is they spent some of that free time interacting with their loved ones, hanging out with their spouse, their friends and family. So we wanted to kind of delve into this effect in greater detail. And we have now run maybe 10, 12 studies, just going to work on this paper over the holiday break.
Mm,
And we see that couples who make time saving purchases together with their significant other report greater relationship satisfaction, less relationship conflict, and that these effects are similar, if not stronger, in magnitude than being a good listener. So that's where the quote comes from. When we control for all these other indicators of
yeah, yeah.
having a high quality relationship, making time saving purchases is really high up there in terms of what predicts relationship satisfaction.
Mm,
And when you unpack these results further, you can see that the benefits of time saving purchases are because couples are able to spend more quality time together. So not
mm.
only do you need to outsource a chore, you also need to reinvest that time in your
Yeah,
relationship.
yeah, yeah, yeah. You have
And
to be
these
with the other person.
yeah,
Yeah.
and these time-saving purchases create quality time. So couples who make time-saving purchases and invest that time with each other that time is more likely to be positive, to feel supportive, to couples are more likely to be present in the moment during that time, probably because their mind is not on that hamster wheel
Mm,
thinking about all the things they need to do around the house.
mhm,
And so that's where this effect comes from. It seems that spending decisions within your relationship can be just as an important predictor of relationship satisfaction as emotional support. And so
mm.
that's where that quote comes from, is just buying time within a relationship can be really positive.
Makes sense. And I mean, on paper, in theory, it makes sense, and then in practice is a whole other thing. So I've used myself as an example as anecdotal evidence. Um, m- m- I hate chores. My wife hates chores. I like outdoor chores, like kind of like puttering around the backyard and the front yard. But like indoor stuff, I absolutely hate it. So we got to a point where my wife was saying like, okay, especially once the little one came around and we were really busy with that, like, okay, why don't we get a cleaner? And I was always kind of resistant. I was hesitant. I think probably because like when I was young growing up, my parents and my like I remember uh, vividly like Saturday, my mom would be just the entire day, just cleaning the entire day, and like she worked during the weekend, and so that was just like I guess normal to me. Like I expected that. And then there was this idea of getting a cleaner, kind of made me feel weird about it. Anyway, so here we are, and we made the. I think I gave it to my wife for a gift for a birthday or an anniversary gift, and she's like, "That was the best," and it's a recurring thing every 2 weeks now, every other Friday, and she's like, "That's the best gift you've ever given me," because it takes, and there is the one sort of explanation you gave, which it frees up more time for like high quality time with her, with between the two of us. But there's also just it's less of a stress because we know we don't have to do that. That's one less thing we have to do when we're on our weekend and wanting to have more leisure time. So it's such a great example. Do you have one other that is sort of similar to the getting a house cleaner or something like that? Anything else that's
Yeah,
helpful
I'll
for
share
listeners?
a tip in just a moment, but I want to react to your story
Yeah, yeah,
for
yeah,
just
yeah.
a second.
Please.
So it does alleviate dread. That's part of the satisfaction benefit of buying time, is you're just not worrying about having to do it. So you get some satisfaction even
Yeah,
before you consume the thing. You get
yeah, yeah.
satisfaction from saving the time, and then satisfaction with not having to worry about whatever it is you're supposed to do. But I will emphasize one point. If you're planning to give a time-saving purchase or service to your spouse as a gift, what
Mm.
you did is a good thing. You talked about it first, and then you knew your
Uh,
partner wanted it, and then you gave it to them as a gift, and it was like, hallelujah, we don't have to do chores anymore. This is the best. What I have observed in my data is if the gift is unexpected and highlights
ah,
discrepancies in chores. So, this is the phenomena I observed among my parents and now have data to support. My dad didn't do much around the house, quintessential, gender dynamics going on.
yeah.
And one Christmas bought my mom a house cleaning service for Christmas, thinking it would help alleviate her stress. All it did was make my mom even more mad at my dad for not doing the chores that she wished he did. So and I see this in my data, when time-saving gifts highlight discrepancies between partners, where one partner wishes the other person was doing more of the chore, and then the other person is seen as trying to throw money at the problem instead of just doing it, these gifts
Mm,
can backfire. So it's really important that you're making this decision together with your partner
mm,
for the happiness benefits to emerge. So that's just for listeners who are like, great, I never do the
yeah,
chores around the house. I'm gonna just go buy my partner a time-saving gift, and
yeah, yeah,
that part of
yeah,
my relationship conflict will be taken care of. Not so fast. Gotta
yeah,
get your
yeah,
partner on
yeah.
board with the idea first.
Good caveat. Good caveat. And so
Yeah,
that saves us
I
from
just needed
getting
to put
some.
that out there before you put that strategy into
Thank you.
practice in your own
Thank you.
life.
That
Yeah.
just like a true scientist to follow up with an important moderator or qualifier that like it saves us from getting some angry emails from listeners saying, "Well, my partner just left me because I got them this gift." Yeah, that's really interesting.
I think it's actually one
Um,
of my favorite findings too, because it explains so many of my parents' fights growing up. I was like, I saw that in my regression table, and
yeah,
I was just like, oh wow, my whole life
uh,
makes sense. Like, oh, that's why my dad's presence never worked.
yeah. Take a picture of the the beta from the regression and send it to them.
Yeah, exactly,
Um,
exactly. And so you were also asking, like, what's
oh
another
yes, one more. Yeah.
strategy that we can put into practice in our own life to have more time and better social relationships? I think in addition to funding time, there's strategies that we can all engage in to help reframe the negative moments that we have on an everyday basis. And so these reframing exercises don't involve any money at all, which is why I like to remind ourselves of them. But
Mm,
sometimes there's things we have to do that aren't that pleasant that we can't get out of. We have to file end of year taxes or do budgeting, or we have to sometimes vacuum, and we're not going to outsource every task. And we shouldn't outsource every task. Also, I see in my data, you want to spend sort of a medium amount of money outsourcing. Once you start outsourcing everything, this actually undermines your satisfaction and perceived
mm,
competence in your life. So there's sort of like this sweet spot of outsourcing sometimes, but
mm,
not everything. Um, and so another thing that we can do to maximize the happiness benefits that we get from our free time is reframing time. One of my collaborators, Colin West, has a great paper that just came out earlier this year showing that if we think about our upcoming weekend like a vacation,
mm,
we savor the weekend more. So we get more satisfaction from everyday experiences. We feel less distracted. We feel more present in the moment. And so this is just one strategy out of many suggesting that just the way we think about our free time can go a long way in helping to predict the happiness benefits. Another data point that we have on this question is more related to work. My doctoral student who just defended today, so sad she's
oh
leaving the lab,
wow,
but very happy for her. She's off to Google to be a people scientist. She's
wow,
Dr. Jaewon Yoon. She's amazing. So
awesome.
one of her papers shows that we can help ourselves feel more positive and less stressed out by drudgery work in our day-to-day jobs when we
Mm,
remind ourselves that that task helps other people get their critical work done. So it's not necessarily trying to convince ourselves that this budgeting task is going to save the world. Those kind of
yeah,
broad purpose interventions actually backfire when you're working on a kind of crappy task that we all are faced with. But if you just remind yourself, hey, this work is going to help my colleague get their work done faster, this can
yeah,
go a long way in reducing the stress of and unpleasantness of doing some of these tasks that ultimately we all have to do, but sometimes don't feel very pleasant in the moment.
yeah, yeah. I love that. I love. Well, I mean, framing effects are just so easy. It's like the one hack kind of that can be applied readily and easily. And for me, if to be totally honest, I was like, well, I'm reading your book and I'm talking to you, so I should have read the book and know know what I'm talking about to be a good host. And so I was like, well, I'm running out of time. And yesterday I was reading, and I kind of was like, here I am stressed. And then I read about the framing. So this was like this meta experience that I had, and I applied this framing to be like, I'm sitting here reading a book that I find really interesting on research that I like, by a researcher who's awesome, who was great TED Talks, and who's Canadian. And that's like part of my job. Why am I stressed about this? So I just applied this very sort of paused and applied this little reframe, and it sort of changed my outlook in that moment, where I went from something that was a task to do to something that was more enjoyable. So that's my little experience with your book specifically. So let's talk about. There's a few things here. Let's talk about Taylor and Morgan, the Taylor and Morgan scenarios. Um, for listeners who are wondering what the heck we're talking about. Could you explain what that is and how it
Yeah.
works?
Yeah. So this whole idea of like time and money trade-offs is where I started to get really interested in the topic of time and happiness in the first place. And so there's a lot of research showing that people who focus more on owning material things, people who are materialistic from an academic term perspective, are less happy because they kind of over focus on stuff and underinvest in social relationships. And there's also a great deal of research suggesting time affluence is good for happiness. People who feel like they have more time or more pro-social, they're more likely to help others, volunteer, and they engage in social interactions more. There's kind of nothing in the literature when I started recognizing that so many of the decisions that we make around Money also have implications for the way that we spend our time. So if we're researching for the best deal on the internet to save a few bucks, this is actually coming at the cost of our free time and being able to do other things with that time. And of course,
Hmm.
in the space of job choices, so many of our career decisions also involve trade-offs between time and money. We will work more hours for a higher paying job, so we'll have less free time available. And so I became interested in whether there are some people who walk around the world with a better sense of these trade offs and put one of these resources, either money or time, first. So, in a lot of my data sets in my dissertation, I think I ran like a dozen studies on this with adults all over the world. I asked people a really simple question: are you more like Taylor or are you more like Morgan? Taylor prioritizes time over money and is willing to give up money to have more time, like by working fewer hours. Morgan values money more than time, is willing to give up time but to have more money, like by working more hours instead of having more vacation. And what I found pretty interestingly was that people's responses to whether they're more like Taylor or more like Morgan significantly predicted people's happiness, the extent to which they invest in social relationships, their career decisions, and how happy they feel several years after college graduation based on these career decisions. And that these effects held controlling for other factors that could have explained the relationship, like how much people like stuff or how much free time people have available, their demographic background. And
Hmm.
so you can kind of figure out, it's a rough proxy for figuring out how time poor you are too. If you're someone who's way more a Morgan, so you can also think about this on a spectrum. If you're someone who's way more likely to prioritize money and productivity, then you probably have way less time available to you as well. And so you might
Mm.
want to be thinking about finding time or funding time, reframing time. May need to invest more in the time element of your life, given that you're giving up so much of your leisure in order to work and make money and be productive. For listeners who might be interested, we do see a pretty equal split, regardless of who I study, how old they are, gender, personality, between people who say they're more like Taylor versus Morgan.
That
With
was
a
my
slight
follow-up question was
yeah,
what's the ratio?
yeah, with a slight preference for time, so it's about 60-40. And really
Hmm.
unsurprisingly, people who are older are more likely to value time over money. And in contrast to the idea that time-focused people are like the weed smoking, chilling types, like, which is something that my advisor and I thought a lot about, is like, we're from Vancouver, is like, who
Yeah,
are
just a
these
bunch of
Taylors
potheads.
exactly? People who are Taylors are usually working less but making more money. So it seems like they're kind of more efficient with their
Interesting.
time. We also know that financial security, the feeling of having enough money, pushes around people's preferences more than the amount of money that people objectively have. So, for example, it doesn't really matter how much money you have in the bank. That doesn't really predict whether you're a Taylor or Morgan. But if you feel really unsure about how much money you're going to make in the future, you're much more likely to be a Morgan than a Taylor. You're worried about your financial future. And so you're focusing much more on money and productivity, which I think makes sense from a psychological perspective, like a safety perspective.
That's fascinating. I love that. And there's this other link you discuss on prosociality, which we've touched on and we've hinted at. Do you think it's such that people who are more time affluent tend to engage in more sort of pro-social behaviors, to sort of, you know, hang out with friends and family and loved ones more often and in a more meaningful way? Do you think it's a bit of a bi-directional effect, or maybe you know from the data, like people who are inherently more pro-social end up selecting into life and a set of experiences that make them more time affluent? Do you
Yeah,
know?
so it's definitely, this is a great question and something we got asked a lot. So are happier people just more likely to prioritize time because they have better
Mm,
hobbies, so they want more free time so they can invest more in those hobbies, and they have more friends than people who are,
yeah.
Morgans, and so it's just that actually the causal arrow goes in the opposite direction, so happier, more pro-social people are more likely to value time. We have evidence, so although that's totally possible and might be some of what's going on in our correlational data, we do have longitudinal perspective data, which speaks to this idea that people's values shape their happiness and their decisions over time, so that it's which then affects their downstream happiness. So it's not
Hmm.
just that happier people are more likely to choose time, but choosing time creates greater happiness in the future. So
Yeah.
surveyed 2,000 graduating college students, and we looked at whether they valued time or whether they valued money. And then we tracked their happiness and career decisions for 2 to 3 years. And we saw that students who valued time more than money were more likely to opt into careers for more intrinsically motivated reasons. So careers that they
Mm,
wanted to have versus they had to have, or they felt like they were doing for some external reason, like pleasing their parents or financial incentives. And this intrinsic motivation in turn predicted their happiness 2 to 3 years later. So valuing time puts students on a trajectory that shaped their major life decisions and
mm.
increase their happiness 2 to 3 years later, controlling for their baseline levels of happiness.
Wow. Wow.
So this does provide pretty compelling evidence that people's values can actually increase their happiness via major life decisions.
Hmm.
And it's not just that happier people who've already made these decisions are more likely to
Yeah,
value time.
that's great. Are those data published, or is
Yeah,
that
so that was
yeah?
published in Science Advances last year.
All right, I'll make sure we link to that. So, on the history of, or maybe even the philosophy of time, gets at this question of why do we value money over time, so many of us and so often in our life? And I think part of it is for status reasons. And obviously, as we know, status gets traced all the way back to these our ancestral humans and these sort of evolutionary based explanations of why we seek this thing is to achieve status within a hierarchy and all the benefits that that confers. Why I set that. Now let's put that against this idea, which I don't think it's as much now, but it used to be back in, like, I don't know, the 50s, let's say. I'm pulling that arbitrarily, where those who had more leisure time were seen as, the rich, the ones who had enough money that they could take that time off. That used to be a thing. It seems like it's not so much now, where, because of, what do you call it, workism, sort of like we're addicted to work, and it sort of sends these positive signals to bosses and collaborators that if we're always working, we're crazy busy, as you say in the book, that that we're of high status. So was there an inflection point? Sort of, what's that history there, culturally speaking, of the trade-off between time and money?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating question and something we've started to collect data on. So, there has been a fundamental societal shift where busyness is now the currency of modern society, especially in North American cultural contexts. We
Hmm.
use constant responsivity as a proxy for commitment, especially in workplace environments that are increasingly hard to determine whether employee A is better than employee B because we're not making widgets in a factory. So,
Hmm.
as output has become more abstract and harder to measure and quantify, we've started to use responsivity to email as a proxy for commitment and quality of work. It's not a good proxy, but this is what organizations have started to do.
Hmm.
So that's part of how busyness has become a currency of high status, especially in North American cultural context. Sylvia Beliza has a great paper showing that busyness is seen as a status symbol. So the more crazy busy you are, the more
Hmm.
that people give you higher status in workplace and social context, and that this effect is only true in the U.S. and not when they went to rerun this. Study in Italy, where Francesca Gino, or one of her colleagues, is from, the opposite was true. People who had more leisure
Yeah,
time were the ones that were high status, like,
interesting.
that person must be doing something right if they're successful at their jobs and have a lot of time to spare. But that's not the dominant narrative in North American cultural context. And we've shown there's
Hmm.
also variability within the US. So we have a new working paper trying to understand what's the role of Protestant work ethic in predicting whether and how much people work and whether work is related to stress and unhappiness. So, what we find using a whole bunch of different data sets in the US is that in places that are culturally, like historically Protestant work ethic, which has a fundamental belief that leisure is lazy and work is good,
Hmm.
that work hours do not necessarily translate into greater unhappiness. And people actually derive less satisfaction from their leisure in places where there's high work norms. We don't know
Wow.
exactly what the mechanism is. So it could be that there's less opportunity for leisure
Mm.
because everyone around you is working a lot. And so leisure involves social coordination and there's just no one to
Mm.
socialize with. So you don't get as much satisfaction out of the leisure. Or it could be this status mechanism Or it could be distraction, disruption. So in a place where the work hours are high, everyone around you is working a lot, even if you have leisure time available, you're just getting constantly interrupted, barraged by work, so you're not really enjoying it. So we're trying to understand the mechanisms in subsequent follow-up studies, but our paper suggests that when work norms are high, we don't get the same benefit from leisure as we do in places where people are working slightly fewer hours and are prioritizing things other than work.
Very cool. And that's a working paper.
Yeah,
So
we just
lots
submitted
of
it, so
stuff.
I'm sure it'll get
Oh, you did.
rejected, like, several times, and then it'll come out in, like, 2.5 years. Yes.
I was saying to one of my collaborators, we're about to submit, and I was like, okay, let's play the publication Plinko game, where you sort of aim high, and it's like rejected, 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 rejected. Found a home. Perfect.
Yeah,
That's the one.
exactly, that's exactly how it works, I love it.
Well, speaking of time, I don't want to keep you above our own time, but this has been great, and this flew by. I have many more pages of notes, so we'll have to have you back in 2021, and we'll ask you how your time's going, and you'll be married then too.
Yeah, so hopefully everything's still going well.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure it will. Well, Ashley, thanks again for coming on, and congrats on the great book.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in this episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting and easy to apply sciencey stuff. Just head on over to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. The show is edited and co-produced by Laura Christine and Noelle Rain, and visual artwork, banners, and animated GIFs created by the talented Iris Deng of dengit.org. That's DENGIT.org. Definitely go and check it out. Lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcast fix. Quite a bit of work goes into these episodes, and a little love would go a long way. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.